Happy Generational Wealth Wednesday. She got Jimmy from my advisor, JimmyHoward.com. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. As always, today we're just going to have a brief discussion about a book I have had the opportunity to read over the last couple of days, and it's entitled Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, an International Perspective, and the author is Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is an American economist. And he's also a fellow at Stanford. So in this book, I think the entire basis was highlighting not just the disparities in wealth, but the disparities in the things that create wealth. One of the points that he made was about, even when you look at the households of kids, you may notice a difference in the amount of books that are even available for that child to access in their home while they're growing up, and how something as simple as that could play a role as far as the wealth disparities between socioeconomic classes. He also pointed out, so it was a historical context. He gave a lot of historical context to illustrate his points. So he also mentioned, in history, how geography also played a role in influencing economic outcomes, and how something as simple as landscape, like for example, when you have communities that were living in the mountains versus communities that lived in the plainlands of America, and how just the geography alone could either facilitate or impede growth. The landscape could be something that either fosters trade or it deters trade amongst other cultures. He also pointed out, and I think the reason, he talked a lot about the history is because although we do not live in the past lives in us. And I really love, that point that he emphasized. He talked about environment versus culture, with environment being external factors, your upbringing, and culture being lifestyle. And it made me think of a song, DJ Ump and Andre 3000 on Walking Out remix. And by the way, shout out to Andre 3000, who recently came out of retirement on the Get 'Em Up album. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, I haven't listened to it in its entirety as of yet, but that's another story. But anyways, in this particular song, Andre 3000, I'll never forget, he made the statement, he was like, I'm not a hood ninja, but a ninja from the hood. And I know it's subtle, but when you think about it, my interpretation of it is simple. It's similar to this argument as far as what he was saying. I'm from the hood. That's my environment. But I'm not a hood ninja because that's my culture. Hood ninja is a mind state. And so, therefore, your environment does not have to be a predestination to, where you're headed in life. So, environment versus culture, and how you can have cultural behaviors and cultural inheritance that may not be reflective of progression, but actual retrogressions in society. He gave an example of different cultures, Fujianese, Jews, Lebanese, and Chinese, and he outlined their upward mobility process. And this is something that is evident if you just pay careful attention in your own neighborhoods. You talked about how if you're on the outside looking in, you would think that when you see these Chinatowns and clusters of people living in a specific community, you think that it's by happenstance, but it was actually organized action. They were very intentional about it. So that's like the first step. They move in clusters in a specific area, And they start out as peddlers, selling their products and stuff in the streets until they can save up enough money to get a storefront. Now, once they get the storefront, it becomes a family business. The mom and dad usually runs the business full time. And they sometimes, depending on where they're located, if they can have a living quarters either next door to the store or, some retail storefronts, you can have a living quarters above and the retail store below. And then they also have the children working in the stores when they're not in school. Now, I've seen this in action, and I used to think that the children were in stores because of the language barrier, because usually if you have, people coming in from another country, English is not their native language, and the children usually can speak better English. So I thought it was for that purpose. But they're actually instilling cultural values such as, hard work and entrepreneurship in those kids at an early age, so that once they get older, they don't part, from those values that were instilled in them at an early age. So I thought that was a very eye-opening point. He also, touched on one of my favorite topics, such as human capital, and, made the point that human capital is not synonymous with formal schooling, meaning that more schooling does not equate to human capital. So you can, if you achieve the highest levels of education, if you never distribute that human capital, it's pretty much pointless. And again, talked about how education is a cultural value. Going back to, like I said, with the Chinese culture, I know for myself, it has been said that they teach their children that work is my work, but school is your work. So that's why they, work really hard in school, because they let them know that this is your way out. This is your ticket out, higher education. And the thing I want to point out that he made about education is it's not just going to school, but it's also making sure that you're studying the right things. The hard, things that's challenging, or in careers that are in demand, such as, the medical fields, the science fields, the law, math, things such as that. Because you can also go to school and get highly educated in subjects that, aren't in demand. So you have the education, but you don't have the skills that are in demand. So it's almost, you may have heard the saying that, sending your kids to school to, have them beautifully equipped to enter a world that no longer exists, once they're done with their schooling. And so going back, he also talked about this study that they did whereby children who were brought up in households where the parents were working professionals were exposed to 2,100 words per hour at minimum. That's average. They were exposed to 2,100 words per hour. And then you have a working class family, and that child was exposed to around 1,200 words per hour. And then when you have a child that grew up where the household is, a welfare recipient, that child is only exposed to 600 words per hour. Now, imagine, what implications that have, on the child in the long run. So if you futurecast, that study, basically it was saying that a 10-year-old child that grew up in a household as a welfare recipient would not have been exposed to more words than a 3-year-old child that grows up in a household where the parents are working professionals. So, I thought that was deep. What else? Let's see. Also, he made a point, knowledge. Knowledge is one of the only possessions that can be given to another person without the giver possessing any less for himself. I thought that was dope. But honestly, I think it was time, I think the thing that he really wanted to just emphasize was just this whole idea of our cultural legacy. A lot of times I talk about legacy and we talk about individual legacy, but our cultural legacy, we have to really ask ourselves, what is the cultural legacy that we're leaving behind for the next generation? Are we a culture that promotes socially destructive behavior, or are we going to leave behind a culture that embraces and champions, education, educational achievements, um, unity, morals, and values, or are we going to be that culture? So, and it's time to give an honest recognition to those implications because, regardless of who's in power, we're talking about a political aspect, regardless of who's in power, government is limited as far as what they can do to change culture. Very seldom can an outsider influence culture. They can change environment. They can influence environments. But changing culture is an inside job. It's up to you and I to change our cultural values. And, the other point that he made about, from the political aspect, he talked about, the welfare state and how it was really the beginning of the breakdown of the black family. And that's when you start having the rise of the single mom, not just the single mom, but the young single mom. So, that young single mom being detached from, values of the previous generation and things like that. So all in all, I think the book, was pretty dope book, a pretty good read. He gives, like I said, he gives a lot of historical context, talks about a lot of geography. But if you can get beyond that and get to the heart of the matter, I think it's definitely worth the time investment. So again, that's Wealth, Poverty, and Politics from author Thomas Sowell. So that's just my tidbit for today, guys. I hope everybody's out there doing well. Thank you for tuning in. And as always, happy Generational Wealth Wednesday. Peace.